What if I told you that watching your sister steal your husband could be the most satisfying revenge you never planned? What if the betrayal that was meant to destroy you became the very weapon that saved your life? My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I died at 28 years old on a snowy Tuesday evening in Denver, Colorado. But death wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the most calculated, strategic takedown I never knew I was capable of. Picture this. You wake up 3 years in the past, back in the apartment where your future husband first said he loved you, with complete knowledge of how your sister, your parents, your best friend would systematically destroy everything you worked for. You know about the gambling debts, the embezzlement, the credit card fraud committed in your name. You know about the whispered conversations and the manipulative family dinners. Most importantly, you know that the man you thought was your soulmate is actually a financial predator who views you as nothing more than a bank account with benefits. What would you do? Confront them? Run away? Fight for what you thought was yours? I did something different. Something that would have terrified the naive woman I used to be. I stepped back, opened the door wide, and let them walk straight into the trap of their own making. Because sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't what you do to your enemies. Sometimes it's simply giving them exactly what they think they want and watching them destroy themselves with it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The last thing I remembered from my first life was the sound of metal crushing metal, the smell of burning rubber, and Jessica's voice crackling through my phone's speaker. Sarah, I need to tell you something about Michael. Then darkness. Cold. Nothing. The first thing I experienced in my second life was sunlight. Warm, golden Colorado morning sunlight streaming through the familiar windows of my old Cherry Creek apartment. The one with the exposed brick walls that I had loved so. Much before Michael convinced me we needed something bigger, something more impressive for his business associates. I was lying in my old bed, the vintage iron frame that Michael had called college kid furniture, and he persuaded me to replace it with his preferred black leather monstrosity. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. The digital clock beside my bed read 7:23 a.m., March 15th. The same date, 3 years ago, when Michael had planned our 6-month anniversary dinner at the kitchen in Cherry Creek. The same morning when I'd woken up nervously excited about our relationship milestone, completely unaware that I was about to accept a proposal from a man who would spend the next 3 years systematically destroying my life. But this wasn't a dream. Every detail was too sharp, too real. The familiar weight of my old comforter, the scent of the vanilla candle I used to burn every morning before Michael complained that strong smells gave him headaches, the sound of my upstairs neighbor's dog scratching at the hardwood floors. Even the tiny chip in my coffee mug, the blue ceramic one that Jessica had given me for my birthday 2 years earlier, claiming she'd picked it out specially because it reminded her of my eyes. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding as the implications crashed over me like a Denver thunderstorm. Somehow, impossibly, I was back. Back before the engagement, before the wedding planning that drained my savings, before I discovered Michael's gambling addiction, before Jessica's systematic campaign to steal my life, before the credit cards opened in my name, before the embezzlement from his construction company that would eventually bankrupt us both, back before I knew what kind of people I was surrounded by. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, and I reached for it with trembling fingers. Tonight, the anniversary dinner that would change everything. In my previous life, this had been the most romantic evening of my existence. Michael had reserved a private table overlooking Cherry Creek, ordered my favorite Pinot Grigio from Oregon, and gotten down on one knee in front of the entire restaurant. I'd cried tears of joy when he slipped that diamond ring onto my finger. The ring that I would later discover he'd bought with money stolen from his business partner's retirement fund. I scrolled through my phone, checking the date again and again, trying to process what was happening to me. March 15th, 3 years ago, the day that set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in my death on Interstate 25, alone in my car after discovering that everyone I trusted had been lying to me for years. Now, standing up on shaky legs, I walked to the bathroom mirror and stared at my reflection. 25 years old again, my face unlined by the stress and heartbreak that would mark my features in the years to come. My dark brown hair fell past my shoulders in the natural waves that Michael would later convince me to straighten because it looked more professional. My green eyes were bright and trusting, unmarked by the shadows that would appear as I gradually realized how thoroughly I'd been betrayed by the people closest to me. This was me before I knew that my mother had been feeding information about my finances to Jessica, before I discovered that my father had been encouraging Michael to take control of my career decisions, before I found out that my best friend, Amanda, had been reporting back to my sister about every doubt, every concern, every vulnerable moment I'd shared in confidence. As I brushed my teeth with automatic motions, memories from my first life flooded back with crystal clarity.
All the way.
Michael's gambling had started small, just office pools and friendly poker games with his construction crew. How it had escalated to secret trips to the casino in Blackhawk, then online betting that consumed our joint savings account while I worked 60-hour weeks at my marketing firm to support what I thought were business investments. I remembered the night I'd found the credit card statements hidden in his truck. Thousands of dollars charged to accounts I'd never opened, all using information he'd had access to through our shared financial planning. The way he'd gasped and stammered when I confronted him. How quickly his panic had turned to anger, shouting that I was paranoid and controlling, that I didn't trust him to make decisions for our future. I remembered calling Jessica that night, sobbing into the phone as I told her about the debts and the lies, how she'd comforted me with all the right words, promising to talk to him, to help us work things out as a family. What I hadn't known then was that she'd been sleeping with him for 8 months already, and that my tears were simply confirmation that their plan was working perfectly. The shower water ran cold as I stood there remembering the devastating final year of my first life. How Michael had convinced me to take out a second mortgage on my grandmother's house to invest in a construction project that existed only on paper. How Jessica had moved in with us temporarily after losing her apartment, then gradually taken over every aspect of our home life, while I worked desperately trying to keep us financially afloat. I remembered the family interventions, where my parents sat me down to express their concerns about my controlling behavior and my inability to support Michael's entrepreneurial spirit. How they'd suggested that maybe Jessica, with her natural domestic instincts, might be a better partner for a man with Michael's ambitions. Most painfully, I remembered the morning I'd come home early from a business trip to find them together in our bed, in the house that my grandmother had left me, sleeping on the sheets I'd bought with my own money. The way they'd looked at me, standing in the doorway, not with shame or remorse, but with relief that they no longer had to hide. "Sarah, we can explain," Michael had said, not even bothering to cover himself as Jessica pulled the comforter up to her chin. Actually, Jessica had added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "We're glad you found out. We've been wanting to tell you for months. We're in love, Sarah, real love, the kind you and Michael never had." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That conversation had lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of them explaining how their relationship had just happened, how they'd tried to fight their feelings out of loyalty to me, how they hoped I could be happy for them, since they were clearly meant to be together. 3 hours of my sister and my fiancé systematically dismantling every shared memory, every moment of intimacy, every foundation of trust I'd built my adult life upon. They'd offered to let me stay in the guest room until I figured things out. Jessica had even suggested that maybe this was a blessing in disguise. Maybe I'd been holding Michael back from reaching his full potential, that maybe I was too focused on my career to be the kind of wife a successful man needed. Standing in my old shower 3 years in the past, I felt a cold fury unlike anything I'd experienced in my previous life, because now I knew the complete truth. Now I understood that this hadn't been a tragic misunderstanding or a case of unexpected love conquering all. This had been a calculated, systematic campaign to steal my life, orchestrated by people who were supposed to love and protect me. But this time, I had something they would never see coming. I had knowledge. I knew about Michael's gambling addiction before he'd learned to hide it effectively. I knew about the money he would steal from his business partner, David Thompson's retirement account, I knew about the credit cards Jessica would open in my name, about the way my parents would pressure me to sign power of attorney documents disguised as insurance, paperwork, when Michael's debts finally caught up with him. Most importantly, I knew how it would all end. Michael's construction business would collapse under the weight of his debts and poor decisions. Jessica would find herself trapped with a man whose charm disappeared the moment he no longer had access to my money. My parents would lose their retirement savings trying to bail them out, and I would die alone, broke and broken, in a car accident that happened because I was fleeing the wreckage of a life that everyone else destroyed while claiming to love me. But not this time. This time I had a plan. Getting dressed in clothes I'd forgotten I owned, I studied my reflection one more time. The woman looking back at me had the same face, the same body, the same gentle nature that had made me such an easy target in my first life. But behind those green eyes was a mind that had been forged in the fire of absolute betrayal. I was no longer the trusting, optimistic Sarah Mitchell who believed that family meant everything and that love conquered all. It was someone new, someone who understood that sometimes the most devastating weapon you can use against your enemies is simply stepping out of their way and letting them destroy themselves. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Michael. Hope you're not too nervous about tonight. I have a feeling it's going to change everything. If only he knew how right he was. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, checking my reflection. One last time in the hallway mirror. I had 8 hours before the dinner that would set everything in motion. 8 hours to begin laying the groundwork for the most satisfying revenge that none of them would see coming until it was too late. Because this time, I wasn't going to fight for Michael's love or Jessica's loyalty or my parents' approval. This time, I was going to give them exactly what they wanted and watch them learn why they should have been careful what they wished for. The morning air was crisp and clean as I stepped outside my apartment building, the kind of perfect Denver spring, day that made everything seem possible. Birds were singing in the old oak trees that lined the street, and the mountains were clearly visible in the distance, their snow-capped peaks catching the early sunlight like a promise. I had work to do, phone calls to make, accounts to check, documents to review. In my first life, I'd trusted other people to handle the details while I focused on being a good daughter, a loving sister, a supportive fiancé. This time I would be handling every detail myself, because I'd learned something in death that I'd never understood in life. The people who claim to love you the most are often the ones most capable of destroying you. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved is to step back and let them face the consequences of their choices without your protection. Tonight, Michael would propose. I would say yes, just as I had before. But this time, I would be watching every move, documenting every lie, preparing for every betrayal. This time, when Jessica made her play for my life, I would already be 10 steps ahead. This time I was going to save myself by letting them have everything they thought they wanted. And when it all came crashing down around them, as I now knew it inevitably would, I would be standing safely in the distance, watching the people who had destroyed me learn what it felt like to lose everything that mattered.
The game was about
To begin, and this time, I knew exactly how it ended. The kitchen in Cherry Creek buzzed with the usual dinner crowd as I sat across from Michael Rodriguez, watching him nervously fidget with the small velvet box he thought I couldn't see bulging in his jacket pocket. The restaurant's warm lighting cast golden shadows across his angular face, highlighting the 5 o'clock shadow that I used to find so attractive. Now knowing what I knew about the man behind that carefully maintained exterior, I found myself studying him like a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen of predator. Michael had always been handsome in that rugged, working-man way that made women stop and stare. Dark hair that he kept just slightly tousled, brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, hands that were calloused from actual construction. Work in his early days, before he'd moved into the management side of his business and started viewing his company as his personal piggy bank. At 30 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. At least that's what he believed about himself. "You seem quiet tonight," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. His fingers were warm, his touch gentle, and seemingly sincere. In my previous life, that touch had made my heart race with anticipation for our future together. Now I felt only a cold, analytical interest in watching him perform the role of devoted boyfriend. Everything okay at work? It's the usual end of quarter stress. I replied with a smile that felt surprisingly natural, considering the circumstances. Patricia has been pushing everyone hard to close out our client campaigns before the March deadline. This was true, actually. Patricia Williams, my boss at the marketing firm, was notorious for her demanding standards and her ability to squeeze every ounce of productivity out of her staff during crucial periods. What Michael didn't know was that I'd volunteered for additional responsibilities this quarter, deliberately overloading my schedule in preparation for what was coming. In my first life, I'd been so focused on our relationship and wedding planning that I'd coasted professionally during this period. This time I was building my career systematically, creating the financial independence I'd need when everything fell apart. Maybe you should consider cutting back your hours once we're married, Michael suggested, his voice carrying that particular tone of masculine concern that I now recognized as manipulation disguised as protection. I'm in my business is doing well enough that you wouldn't need to work those crazy hours anymore. You could focus on the things that really matter. There it was. The first subtle attempt to isolate me from my career, my income, my independence. In my previous life, I'd found this suggestion romantic, a sign that he wanted to take care of me. Now I understood it for what it really was, the opening move in a campaign to make me financially dependent on him, easier to control and exploit. That's sweet of you to worry, I said, squeezing his hand affectionately. But I love my work. Besides, I'm up for a promotion to senior account manager next month. The salary increase would really help us build a solid foundation for our future. I watched his face carefully as I mentioned the promotion, a detail I deliberately kept from him in both timelines. In my first life, I'd shared every professional development with him immediately, seeking his support and celebration. This time, I was learning to keep certain cards close to my chest. The flicker of interest that crossed his features when I mentioned the salary increase told me everything I needed to know about his true priorities. That's fantastic, babe, he said, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was already calculating how much more money would be flowing through our joint accounts, how much more he'd have access to for his gambling and his schemes. We should definitely celebrate if you get it. The waiter approached our table, a young man with an eager smile who clearly recognized the significance of the evening from Michael's nervous energy and the carefully arranged romantic atmosphere. Michael had requested the corner table with the view of the creek, pre-ordered my favorite wine, had even arranged for the kitchen to prepare the special off-menu dessert that I'd mentioned loving during our third date 6 months ago. In my previous life, all of these thoughtful details had convinced me that Michael truly understood and cherished me. Now I realized they were simply the product of careful research, the same kind of attention to detail that any successful con artist pays to their mark. Michael was good at making women feel special, feel seen, feel chosen. It was a skill he'd honed through years of practice, long before he'd set his sights on me and my grandmother's inheritance. "Are you ready to order?" the waiter asked, and Michael nodded, gesturing for me to go first with old-fashioned chivalry that had once charmed me completely. I ordered the salmon, the same dish I'd chosen in my first timeline, partly to maintain consistency, and partly because I found a strange comfort in keeping some elements of this evening exactly the same. Michael chose the ribeye, expensive as always, his tastes running toward the finest things that other people's money could buy. As we waited for our meals, Michael regaled me with stories from his construction sites, carefully edited versions of events that painted him as the heroic problem solver, the natural leader, the man who always knew exactly how to handle any crisis. I'd heard these stories before, of course, but this time I knew the truth behind them. The difficult client he'd diplomatically handled had actually been an investor who discovered discrepancies in billing. The equipment crisis he'd solved had been caused by his failure to make payments to suppliers. The personnel issue he'd resolved had involved an employee who'd caught him skimming money from job budgets. "You're such a good listener," Michael said as our entrees arrived, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine affection. "One of the things I love most about you is how you really hear me, you know. Some women, they just wait for their turn to talk, but you actually care about understanding what's important to me." This was true, unfortunately. In both timelines, I was genuinely interested in his thoughts, his struggles, his dreams. The problem wasn't that Michael was wrong about my nature. The problem was that he'd learned to weaponize my empathy against me. Every confidence I offered, every vulnerable moment I shared, every piece of emotional support I provided was being cataloged and stored for future use against me. I do care, I said honestly. I want to understand all of you, the good and the challenging parts. That's what real partnership means to me. Michael's hand tightened on his fork slightly, and I wondered if he could hear the subtle emphasis I'd placed on the word real. Probably not. In my experience, people who live their lives as performances tend to assume everyone else is performing too. They can't imagine the existence of genuine emotion because they've forgotten how to access their own. Speaking of partnership, Michael said, and I felt my pulse quicken despite knowing exactly what was coming next. Sarah, these past 6 months have been incredible. You've changed my life in ways I never expected. He reached into his jacket pocket, and the conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade into background murmur as other diners began to notice what was happening. This was the moment that had defined my previous timeline, the pivot point where my life had begun its downward, spiraled toward destruction and death. I know we haven't been together that long, Michael continued, sliding out of his chair and onto one knee beside our table. But some things you just know, Some people you meet and immediately realize that everything before was just practice for this moment. The velvet box opened to reveal the same ring I remembered, a princess-cut diamond in a platinum setting. Beautiful and expensive and purchased with money that belonged to David Thompson's retirement fund, though I wouldn't discover that fact until much later in my first timeline. The ring caught the restaurant's ambient lighting and threw tiny rainbows. Across the white tablecloth, a symbol of promise and commitment and forever, a symbol of lies. Sarah Mitchell, Michael said, his voice carrying perfectly across the suddenly hushed restaurant. Will you marry me? Every eye in the place was on us. The waiter stood frozen with a wine bottle in his hands. A woman at the table behind Michael had pulled out her phone to record the moment. The ambient sounds of clinking silverware and quiet conversation had stopped entirely, leaving only the soft jazz playing over the restaurant's sound system and the faint murmur of traffic from the street outside. This was theater, I realized with crystal clarity, not just for my benefit, but for his. Michael fed on moments like this, situations where he was the center of attention, where his charm and his romantic gestures made him the hero of someone else's story. The proposal wasn't really about our future together. It was about his ego, his need to be seen as the kind of man who swept women off their feet with grand romantic gestures. Yes, I said, letting tears gather in my eyes exactly as they had 3 years ago. Yes, of course I'll marry you. The restaurant erupted in applause and cheers. Michael slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook slightly either from nerves or excitement or the anticipation of finally having legal access to my assets. The diamond felt cold and heavy against my skin, a weight that I now understood as the anchor that would drag me down if I let it. But I wouldn't let it, not this time. Michael kissed me then, in front of everyone, a passionate embrace that sealed our engagement and our fate. His lips were warm and familiar, his cologne, the same woodsy scent that I had once found intoxicating. In my previous life, this kiss had felt like the beginning of everything. Now it felt like the end of his freedom to manipulate me without consequences. I love you so much, he whispered against my ear as the applause died down and conversations gradually resumed around us. You've made me the happiest man alive. I love you too, I replied, meaning it in a way that would have surprised him if he'd been capable of understanding the complexity of human emotion. I did love him, or rather, I loved the man I'd thought he was. I loved the version of Michael Rodriguez that existed only in my imagination. The honest contractor with big dreams and a good heart who'd simply made some poor choices along the way. The real Michael, the one kneeling beside me with triumph, gleaming in his dark eyes, was someone else entirely. Someone I was going to enjoy destroying methodically and completely. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of congratulations from strangers, champagne sent over by other couples celebrating anniversaries, and phone calls to family members who'd been waiting for this news. Michael called his mother first. A sweet woman named Maria, who lived in Pueblo, and who'd never had any idea what kind of man her son had become. I called my parents, listening to Mom's squeals of delight and Dad's gruff congratulations, knowing that both of them were already calculating how this engagement would benefit their younger daughter. Finally, inevitably, I called Jessica. Sarah. Oh my God, tell me everything. Jessica's voice bubbled with what sounded like genuine excitement. And if I hadn't lived through the aftermath once already, I might have believed it was real. Are you engaged? Please tell me you're engaged. We're engaged, I confirmed, holding the phone slightly away from my ear as Jessica erupted into squeals that rivaled our mother's. Michael just proposed at the kitchen. It was perfect. So happy for you, Jessica gushed, and there was enough truth in those words to make them particularly painful. She was happy for me, in the same way that a hunter might be happy for a deer that walked willingly into range. See the ring and hear all the details. Can I come over later? Please, I need to celebrate with my big sister. In my previous timeline, I'd said yes immediately, eager to share this momentous occasion with the person I'd thought was my closest confidant. This time, I hesitated just long enough to plant the first seed of doubt. Actually, Jess, Michael and I were planning to have a quiet evening together, I said, watching Michael's face carefully. You know, just the two of us to really savor this moment. Oh. The disappointment in Jessica's voice was genuine, though I suspected it had more to do with missing an opportunity to begin her reconnaissance than with any sisterly sentiment. Of course, that makes total sense. This is your special night. But how about lunch tomorrow? I offered. I want to tell you everything, and I'll definitely need your help planning the wedding. Yes, absolutely. I'll take a long lunch break, and we can go to that place in Lodoo that you love with the amazing salads. Calf Pariza, I thought automatically. Jessica had never particularly cared for the trendy downtown restaurant with its Mediterranean fusion menu, but she'd learned to love whatever I loved as part of her long-term strategy. To position herself as my closest ally and confidant, after we hung up, Michael reached across the table to take my hand again, his thumb running over the unfamiliar weight of the engagement ring. She sounded excited, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She's always been my biggest supporter when it comes to relationships. She really loves you, you know. The words felt bitter in my mouth, but I delivered them with perfect sincerity. Michael's smile became more genuine at this reassurance, and I filed away his reaction for future reference. Even now, even after securing his primary objective, he was already thinking about Jessica's approval, already valuing her opinion in ways that should have been reserved for me. I'm glad, he said. Family is so important. I want everyone you love to be happy about us being together. Everyone you love. Such an interesting choice of words from a man who was already planning to systematically alienate me from everyone, who might offer support or protection when his true nature eventually revealed itself. We finished dinner in a glow of mutual satisfaction, though I suspected we were each satisfied about very different things. Michael paid the check with his credit card, the same one that I now knew was already carrying a balance he couldn't afford, funded by money skimmed from construction projects and falsified billing statements. As we walked to our cars in the restaurant's parking lot, Michael pulled me close under the soft glow of the streetlights. The night was clear and cold, typical for Denver in March, and I could see the lights of the city sprawling out toward the mountains in the distance. This changes everything, doesn't it? He said, his breath visible in small puffs of vapor. We're really doing this, building a life together. It changes everything, I agreed, though probably not in the way he imagined. Michael kissed me again, longer and more intensely this time, without an audience to perform for. When we broke apart, his eyes were dark with desire and something else that might have been genuine emotion, if I hadn't known better. I should probably get home, I said reluctantly. It's an early meeting tomorrow, and I want to be sharp for it. Of course, I'll call you in the morning. We drove home separately as we had throughout our relationship. Michael had suggested several times that we should move in together, but I'd resisted, claiming I wanted to wait until we were married. In my previous timeline, this decision had been based on old-fashioned romantic notions about propriety and anticipation. This time I was grateful for the wisdom of maintaining separate living spaces for as long as possible. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and stared at the ring on my finger. It was beautiful, undeniably so, and in the soft lamplight of my living room, It looked like a promise of happiness and security. But I knew better now. I knew this ring was a collar disguised as jewelry, a golden chain that was meant to bind me to a man who saw me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. But knowledge, I was learning, was its own kind of power. And this time, I intended to use every advantage I possessed to ensure that the people who had destroyed my life once would never get the chance to do it again. Tomorrow, I would begin the careful work of documenting everything: bank statements, credit reports, business records, personal communications. I would build a case against Michael and Jessica and my parents and everyone else who had participated in my destruction. Not because I intended to take them to court immediately, but because I wanted to be prepared for every eventuality. Time, when the lies started unraveling, I would be the one pulling the threads. The family dinner to celebrate our engagement took place that Saturday evening at my parents' house in Highlands Ranch, sprawling suburban development south of Denver, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, and every house looked like it had been designed by the same committee of people who valued conformity above character. My childhood home was a two-story colonial with cream-colored siding and burgundy shutters. It's a kind of house that screamed middle-class respectability and careful financial planning. What it didn't scream was warmth, though my parents had certainly tried to create that impression over the years with strategic holiday decorations and family photos arranged just so on every available surface. I pulled into the circular driveway behind Jessica's Honda Civic, noting that she'd arrived early, as she always did for family gatherings. In my previous timeline, I'd attributed this habit to enthusiasm and family loyalty. Now I understood it as reconnaissance, an opportunity to coordinate stories and strategies with our parents before I arrived to complicate their plans with my presence. The front door opened before I could ring the bell, and Mom emerged with her arms outstretched and a smile that seemed genuinely delighted. Linda Mitchell was 52 years old, but looked younger, thanks to a disciplined skincare routine and twice-weekly yoga classes that she attended religiously. Her blonde hair was styled in the kind of sophisticated bob that required professional maintenance, and her outfit was carefully coordinated in shades of navy and cream that complemented the house's exterior color scheme. "There's our beautiful bride-to-be," Mom exclaimed, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like her signature perfume, something floral and expensive that she'd worn for as long as I could remember. "Let me see that ring, sweetheart." Jessica told us it was gorgeous, but I need to see it with my own eyes. I extended my left hand obediently, watching Mom's face as she examined the diamond with the kind of attention usually reserved for museum exhibits. Her smile never wavered, but I caught the slight widening of her eyes as she calculated the ring's probable value. Now I recognized it as the expression of someone who was mentally tallying assets and considering how they might be leveraged. "It's absolutely stunning," Mom pronounced, though she held on to my hand a bit longer than necessary, as if she were memorizing details for future reference. "Michael has excellent taste, and such a generous heart." Generous with other people's money, I thought, but didn't say. Instead, I smiled and allowed myself to be ushered into the house, where the familiar scents of Mom's pot roast and Dad's aftershave created an atmosphere of domestic comfort that felt increasingly artificial with each step I took. Something in a soft yellow that complemented her auburn hair and made her look younger and more innocent than her 25 years. She'd always been the prettier. With her delicate features and petite frame that made men want to protect her and women want to mother her, she squealed, launching herself at me with enough force to nearly knock me off balance. "I've been dying to congratulate you properly, and to see this ring that everyone's been talking about." She grabbed my hand with both of hers. In my previous timeline, I'd thought she was simply excited for my happiness. The way she was memorizing every detail of the ring that would eventually end up on her own finger. "It's perfect," Jessica said finally, her voice carrying a wistful note that I now recognized. "As carefully practiced, Michael must really love you to choose something so beautiful. You're so lucky, Sarah. I hope someday I'll find someone who loves me enough to give me something like this." The manipulation in those words was so subtle, so expertly delivered, that I felt a grudging admiration for my sister's skills, even as I despised her intentions. She was planting seeds of guilt, positioning herself as the less fortunate sister, who deserved happiness, but hadn't been blessed with it yet. eager to share my good fortune and help her find the same kind of love I thought I'd found with Michael.
Oh.
Now I understood that Jessica didn't want to find her own Michael. She wanted mine. Dad emerged from his study, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of forced smile that he'd perfected during his 30-year career in insurance sales. Before he'd moved into the business side of things, he'd always been proud of his work ethic and his ability to provide. But I'd noticed over the years that his pride had begun to sour into resentment as he watched younger, less experienced men achieve success that had eluded him. "There's my successful daughter," he said, giving me a hug that felt, whatever else Dad might be guilty of, I believed he did love me in his own complicated way, and a worldview that prioritized men's ambitions over women's independence. "Congratulations, sweetheart," he continued, stepping back to look at me with what? "Michael's a good man, solid, the kind of man who'll take care of you properly." God, take care of me properly. The phrase grated against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. Now I heard it as a reflection of his fundamental belief that women needed men to manage their lives for them. That my education and career and I found a husband willing to assume responsibility for my well-being. We moved into the dining room, where Mom had set the table with her good china and the silver candlesticks that only appeared for special occasions, accompanied by roasted vegetables and homemade bread that filled the house with warm, comforting aromas. In any other circumstances, this would have been a lovely family celebration, the kind of evening that creates cherished memories and reinforces the bonds between people who genuinely care about each other. Instead, it felt like dinner theater, with each of us playing carefully rehearsed roles in a performance whose true purpose remained hidden. Beneath layers of pleasant conversation and familial affection, Jessica said it was incredibly romantic, but we want to hear all the details from the bride herself. I launched into the story. The surprise of the proposal, the reaction of the other diners, noting the subtle glances that passed between Mom and Jessica, the way Dad nodded approvingly at certain details, the manner in which everyone seemed to be listening not just to my words, but for something else entirely. Chose the kitchen specifically because he knew it was one of my favorite restaurants, I concluded. He'd remembered that I mentioned loving their salmon during one of our early dates. "That's so thoughtful," Jessica said with a sigh that sounded wistful, but felt calculated. "It's the little details like that that show a man really pays attention to what matters to you." Most guys would just pick the most expensive place they could find, but Michael chose somewhere that had personal meaning. This was true, actually, though not for the reasons Jessica was implying. Michael had chosen the same way he researched potential construction contracts or investment opportunities. He'd learned my preferences the way a good salesman learns his client's weaknesses. Not because he cared about my happiness, but because he understood that attention to detail was part of the seduction process. "When are you thinking about having the wedding?" Dad asked, refilling our wine glasses with obvious satisfaction. "Please tell me you're not planning one of those year-long engagements. Life's too short to waste time when you know what you want." In my previous timeline, Michael and I had planned a September wedding, giving ourselves 6 months to organize everything. It had seemed like a reasonable timeline, long enough to plan properly, but short enough to satisfy our eagerness to begin. Now I understood that the timeline had been carefully calculated to prevent me from having too much time to discover Michael's true nature before we were legally bound together. "We're thinking September," I said, watching. "It's far enough away to plan everything properly, but not so far that we have to wait forever." "September is perfect," Mom agreed enthusiastically. "That gives us plenty of time to plan a beautiful ceremony without feeling rushed. And the weather is usually gorgeous that time of year. Have you thought about where you'll have it?" Jessica asked, her voice carefully casual. "Somewhere outdoor would be so romantic, especially with the fall colors." I knew where this conversation was heading because I'd lived through it before. Jessica would suggest several venues, all of them expensive and elaborate, gradually steering the conversation toward a wedding that would drain my savings and require financial assistance from Michael. In my previous timeline, I'd been grateful for her enthusiasm and her willingness to help with the planning. This time, I intended to let her dig her own trap. "Actually," I said, taking a sip of wine and choosing my words carefully, "Michael and I have been talking about having something smaller and more intimate. Maybe just immediate family and close friends. We'd rather spend our money on the honeymoon and our future together than on one big party. The silence that followed my words was brief but telling. I watched three faces simultaneously recalculate their expectations, adjusting their mental spreadsheets to account for this unexpected development. "Oh," Mom said finally, her voice carrying a note of disappointment that she tried to disguise as concern. "Are you sure, sweetheart? You only get married once, hopefully, and this is such a special time in your life. You don't want to look back and regret not celebrating properly? A small wedding can be just as meaningful as a large one," Dad added, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. "But your mother has a point about this being a once-in-a-lifetime occasion. Plus," Jessica said, her voice brightening as if she'd just thought of something wonderful, "you have so many friends and colleagues who'd love to celebrate with you. Remember how much fun we had at Cousin Rachel's wedding last summer? Everyone still talks about what a perfect day that was." Cousin Rachel's wedding had cost nearly $30,000, and had required her parents to take out a second mortgage to pay for it. The marriage had lasted 18 months before Rachel discovered that her husband had been cheating with her maid of honor. But it had been a beautiful party, I had to admit. "We're still in the early planning stages," I said diplomatically. "Nothing's set in stone yet. Michael and I want to make sure we're making decisions that feel right for us, not just doing what's expected." This seemed to satisfy everyone for the moment, though I could see the wheels turning behind their eyes. The conversation moved on to other topics: Jessica's new job at a boutique in Cherry Creek, Dad's latest golf game, Mom's book, Club's current selection. Surfacely vowel family chatter that felt increasingly surreal as I sat there knowing what each of these people would eventually do to me. After dinner, Jessica and I helped Mom clear the table while Dad retreated to his study to watch sports highlights. It was during this seemingly innocent domestic ritual that I overheard the conversation that confirmed my worst suspicions about my family's loyalty. I was carrying dirty plates to the kitchen when I heard Mom and Jessica speaking in low voices near the sink, their words barely audible over the running water. "Are you sure about the timeline?" Mom was asking, her voice tight with anxiety. "It seems awfully fast. Trust me," Jessica replied, her tone carrying a confidence that made my blood run cold. "The engagement changes everything. As they're married, she'll be much more willing to make compromises about her career and her independence. Michael's already started talking to her about cutting back her hours at work." "And you're certain he's on board with the plan?" "Completely. He knows what he's getting out of this arrangement, and he's motivated to make it work." "What's the construction?" "Business is more profitable than Sarah realizes, and her salary plus her inheritance will give them a very comfortable lifestyle." I stood frozen in the doorway, dirty plates in my hands, as the full scope of their conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just Jessica falling in love with my fiancé, or Michael having a wandering eye. This was a calculated plan to transfer my assets and my earning potential to people who viewed me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. "What about Sarah?" Mom asked, and for a moment my heart leaped with hope that she might be having second thoughts about participating in my systematic destruction. "Sarah will be fine," Jessica said dismissively. "She's always been the responsible one, the one who lands on her feet. Besides, she have had her chance at happiness. If she can't hold on to Michael, that's not really our fault, is it?" Casualness with which my sister dismissed my future suffering was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire conversation. In her mind, this wasn't cruelty. It was simply the natural order of things. The pretty sister deserved the successful husband. The younger daughter deserved the financial security. I was just an obstacle to be overcome, a temporary inconvenience standing between Jessica and the life she felt entitled to live. I managed to make it to the kitchen and deposit the plates in the sink without dropping them, though my hands were shaking so badly that the china rattled against itself. Mom and Jessica looked up guiltily when I appeared, their conversation dying mid-sentence. "Sorry," I said with a bright smile that felt like it might crack my face. Didn't mean to interrupt. "Just bringing in the last of the dishes." "Well, don't worry about it, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice overly cheerful. "Jessica and I were just talking about wedding planning. So many details to consider." "So many," I agreed, wondering if they could hear the edge in my voice. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dessert and coffee and more family conversation that felt increasingly surreal now that I understood what was really happening beneath the surface. Jessica complimented my engagement ring again, asking detailed questions about the setting and the cut of the diamond. Mom showed me pictures of wedding dresses she'd been bookmarking online, apparently having started her research before I'd even accepted Michael's proposal. Dad offered unsolicited advice about marriage and compromise and the importance of supporting one's husband's ambitions. All of it felt like an elaborate charade designed to make me complicit in my own destruction. When it came time to leave, everyone hugged me with what appeared to be genuine affection. Mom pressed a container of leftover pot roast into my hands, insisting that I needed to take care of myself during this busy and exciting time. Claiming it was for wedding expenses. I suspected it was really his way of assuaging his conscience about what he was allowing to happen to me. Jessica walked me to my car, chattering enthusiastically about wedding venues and flower arrangements and honeymoon destinations. In the soft glow of the streetlights, she looked young and beautiful and completely innocent, the kind of woman that men wanted to protect and other women wanted to befriend. "I'm so happy for you, Sarah," she said as I unlocked my car door. "You deserve all the happiness in the world." "Thank you," I replied, meaning it in a way that would have surprised her if she'd been capable of understanding complexity. "That means everything to me, coming from you." As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I reflected on the evening's revelations. In my previous timeline, I'd left that dinner feeling loved and supported, surrounded by family members who wanted nothing but the best for my future. This time, I understood that I was completely alone, surrounded by people who were actively working to destroy my life while smiling and offering congratulations. But this time, I wasn't the naive, trusting woman who would be blindsided by their betrayal. This time I was the one with the advantage of knowledge, the one who could see the trap being laid and plan accordingly. This time, when Jessica made her move for my life, I would be ready for her. The weeks following our engagement fell into a deceptively comfortable rhythm that felt like happiness if you didn't know what to look for. Michael called every morning before work, his voice warm with affection that sounded genuine until you understood that he was simply checking in to monitor my activities and emotional state. We had dinner together 3 times a week, usually at restaurants that were expensive enough to make me feel special, but not so expensive that they strained. His carefully constructed budget, which was funded by money that belonged to other people. Jessica called me every few days with wedding-related questions and suggestions, positioning herself as my closest advisor and most enthusiastic supporter. She'd taken to stopping by my apartment unannounced, always with a plausible excuse, but really to gather intelligence about my relationship with Michael and my financial situation. Coney, these visits would have felt like sisterly bonding if I hadn't known what she was really doing. My parents checked in regularly, offering help with wedding, planning and expressing their joy about my upcoming marriage with what seemed like genuine parental pride. Dad had even started including Michael in their weekend golf games, claiming that it was important for the men in the family to develop their own relationship independent of me. On the surface, everything looked perfect. I was a successful marketing professional with a loving fiancé and a supportive family, planning a wedding that would mark the beginning of a wonderful new chapter in my life. But underneath that veneer of domestic bliss, I was conducting the most important investigation of my life, documenting evidence and building a case that would eventually save me from the destruction that had claimed my previous timeline. First major revelation came during what appeared to be an innocent lunch date with Jessica at Caf Parisa in downtown Denver. She'd suggested the meeting ostensibly to look at wedding magazines together, but I suspected she had other motives. We'd claimed a table by the windows overlooking Larimar Square, the kind of spot that encouraged lingering conversations over expensive salads and artisanal coffee. Jessica had arrived carrying a stack of bridal magazines and wearing the kind of outfit that managed to be both casual and carefully curated, designer jeans that fit her perfectly. Armed with Caroline's devastating report about Michael's financial crimes and Jessica's complicity, I began implementing what would become the most satisfying revenge of my lifetime. But instead of confronting them directly or exposing their schemes immediately, I chose a far more elegant approach. I would become the perfect victim they expected me to be, while simultaneously setting the stage for their complete destruction. My first move was deceptively simple. I started making myself scarce in ways that would drive them to desperation. When Michael called to suggest dinner dates, I declined with sincere apologies about work commitments. When Jessica proposed wedding dress shopping expeditions, I postponed citing client emergencies. When my parents invited me for family gatherings, I attended but remained distracted, checking my phone frequently and leaving early for imaginary business calls. The effect was immediate and exactly what I'd anticipated. Rather than recognizing my withdrawal as a red flag, they interpreted it as confirmation of their narrative about my misplaced priorities and overwhelming career focus. Michael began expressing concerned observations about my work-life balance. To anyone who would listen, Jessica started making worried comments about my stress levels to our parents. Mom began dropping hints about the importance of slowing down and focusing on what really mattered in life. They were so convinced of their own righteousness that they couldn't imagine I might be playing them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.